Right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about some tech updates from Citrix. So, agenda to kick off. So first up, we're going to be talking about Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktops. So this is really just looking at a few highlights from recent releases and things that are interesting that you may have missed. We're going to have a look at, is 2021 the year of Citrix Workspace? So things have changed around Citrix Workspace and some new capabilities that might mean that that's quite an interesting thing to have a look at this year. We're going to take a look at Citrix Networking, so what's coming up soon with Citrix ADC. And we're going to have a look at security and what's happening in the security space for Citrix. So is Citrix becoming more of a security company? And we'll wrap up by having a look at customer success and how you can work with Ultima and Citrix to increase the value that you're gaining from your investments in Citrix. So first up, questions. Just to make you aware, there is the ability to submit questions for the webinar. We're going to be quite tight on time because, as always, there's a lot of stuff that we want to cover in this. If we have time at the end, I'll go through any questions that you may have. If we don't have time, then if you submit a question, we'll reach out to you offline and just clarify any questions that you may have on any of the topics that we're covering. So do feel free to drop anything into the questions box if you have anything that you want some more information on, or as always, you can reach out to your account manager if you've got any specific queries. So diving straight in, apps and desktops, what's new? So one of the interesting things that's come out recently is natural reboot schedules. So most organizations are going to have, in multi-session environments, they're going to have some form of scheduled reboots. The longer things are up, you do tend to find that you may find some stability issues or you may find some performance issues. So as a best practice, most places will have some form of a scheduled reboot cycle in place. So the way this works at the moment or historically is that you'll define a time that you want things to reboot. So say, for example, you want things to reboot at 2 o'clock in the morning. What's typically going to happen is that you might send a notification to users to say that the server they're connected to is going to reboot and ask them to take an action. So that may be log off and try and log back on in a few minutes. Or if you've staggered your reboots, and it may be just asking them to log off and reconnect to another server, which isn't going to reboot in that time frame. So the new behavior that natural reboot schedules enables is the ability to place servers into a drain mode. So with this mechanism, we've got the ability to be a bit less intrusive for users. So you can define a time that you'd like things to reboot, but rather than forcing reboots during that time, you can actually have multi-session OSs placed into a drain mode. So rather than forcing users to log off and log back on to another resource, you can tell Citrix that you want it to wait until users have actually logged off that session. And then once all user sessions have drained from that server, you've then got the ability to have those servers reboot once they're free of any user sessions. So it's quite a nice behavior, especially in environments where you might have kind of 24/7 usage, and scheduling in maintenance windows or downtime is quite challenging. Being able to perform scheduled reboots in a less disruptive manner is quite a useful feature. So this has been introduced, so it's available in Citrix Cloud in the Apps and Desktop service. It's also available in the latest current release, so Apps and Desktops 2103. So at the moment, this feature isn't implemented in the UI, so it might not necessarily be immediately apparent to people. So it needs to be implemented using PowerShell. So you can do this if you're creating new reboot schedules using PowerShell. You can also update existing reboot schedules using PowerShell by setting the use natural reboot parameter to true, which will cause it to use drain mode rather than forcing reboot. So, and there's a link at the bottom of the slide which goes into more details on how that can be configured and different options that are available. Another interesting one, which has come out towards the tail end of last year, and it's been through a few iterations since its original release, is the automatic configuration tool. So this is a tool set that Citrix provide, which allows you to simplify migrations from on-premises deployments into Citrix Cloud. So the way that this works is it's effectively a set of tools that Citrix provide which allow you to export the configuration from your on-premises environment. So this is a set of PowerShell scripts which will allow you to export your on-premises configuration into a set of YAML files. So some of you may be familiar with YAML. It's used quite a lot in declarative infrastructure tools. So once the configuration is exported to the YAML files, these are basically text files which can then be manipulated directly. So you do have the ability to modify configuration once it's been exported. So if there are some aspects of the configuration that isn't required, then you have the ability to selectively exclude certain bits through modification of the files. But once you've got these configuration files, these can basically be imported into your Citrix Cloud Apps and Desktop service to allow you to replicate the configuration. So really it's about providing a nice easy on-ramp for customers that are looking to move from on-premises environments to apps and desktop services environments. And it can be used more than once. So if you need to keep an on-premises environment in sync with the cloud instance, then you can use these scripts more than once to make sure that you are replicating the current configuration of the environment into Citrix Cloud. So it's a nice tool set there that can really simplify migration projects. So it's definitely something that's worthwhile being aware of. So Rendezvous is an interesting use case. So first up, I want to go over what Rendezvous is. So if you're using Citrix Cloud with the Citrix Gateway service, what happens is, and you should be roughly familiar with this architecture. So you'll have cloud connectors deployed in your resource locations where you host resources. Now, Cloud connectors are going to establish a control channel to the apps and desktop service. So this is just to provide the basic functionality in brokering access to the environment. Where gateway services are in use, the cloud connectors also establish a second control channel which goes out to the Citrix Gateway service. So this is what facilitates access between users and the resources in your resource location. When a user accesses Citrix Workspace, Citrix Workspace is going to talk to the apps and desktop service and pull back a set of resources that they have access to. When the user launches one of those resources, it's going to spin up a connection to the gateway service, and the Citrix Gateway service is going to use the existing control channel that's been established between the cloud connectors and the gateway service to route that user connection through the cloud connectors and to the VDA that the resource is available from. So this is important to understand from for a few reasons. So firstly, that control channel to the gateway services, what enables you to provide remote access without the need to implement firewall rules to allow external users into your environment, because it's a call out mechanism. It's also important to understand that in this model, user connections transit the cloud connectors. So every user connection into the environment is going to be going through the cloud connectors that are hosting your environment. So as you can imagine, as the user numbers increase, there's potentially a bit of a bottleneck there in terms of how the connections are being routed. So what Rendezvous does is it uses a slightly different approach. Also important to note that with connections being routed via the cloud connectors, you can only support TCP-based connections. So EDT isn't an option when you're routing connections via the cloud connectors. So with Rendezvous, rather than the control channel being established from the cloud connectors to the gateway service, the control channel is actually established from the VDAs to the gateway service. So you can see that this mechanism takes the cloud connectors out of line of the actual user connection. So if we have a look at the same connection approach, the user is going to connect to Citrix Workspace. Workspace is going to talk to the apps and desktop service. When the user launches the connection, that connection is going to go to the Citrix Gateway Service POP that's nearest to them. That connection is going to get routed then over the control channel that the VDA has established directly to the VDA that the resource is hosted on. Now, another important aspect here is that this architecture supports the use of EDT, which can be quite important when considering user experience. EDT being the current default and recommended connection protocol for Citrix. So one of the challenges that we have with this model is that in most enterprises, it's not necessarily going to be quite as straightforward as the VDAs just being able to call out the gateway service. What typically happens is that enterprises are going to have proxy servers in place, and as soon as you introduce the proxy server historically, that rendezvous connection where the VDA establishes the connection to the gateway service isn't actually possible. So recent changes. So in 2020, Citrix introduced the ability to support proxies for TCP-based connections, which was fantastic. It's a useful mechanism to allow the decentralization of the connections from the cloud connectors to improve scalability. Now, also late 2020, Citrix introduced the ability to use EDT with the Citrix Gateway service, so being able to support UDP connections. But at the time, if there was a proxy server in path, then using Rendezvous and a proxy server wouldn't actually work. So recently, Citrix have introduced the option of being able to support, utilize a SOC 5 proxy, which does support EDT. So in an enterprise scenario where a proxy needs to be in path, if the proxy supports SOC 5 connections, then you can use Rendezvous now with EDT. So Rendezvous is a bit of a tricky one, and there are a few requirements to make sure that it's actually going to work in your environment. So I just wanted to briefly go through some of the requirements to actually get this working. So for Rendezvous to work at all, you need to be on the VDA 1912 or later. To use EDT with Rendezvous or a non-transparent proxy, so if you need to specify a proxy address, then you'd need to be on the VDA 2012. And if you want to be able to use a pack file to specify proxy addresses, then you'd need to be on VDA version 2103, so the latest current release version at this time. In terms of network access, obviously the VDAs need to be able to establish a connection to the gateway service. And to do this, Citrix recommends that you allow access to certain wildcard addresses. So we can see we've got star.nssvc.net or star.c.nssvc.net or star.g.nssvc.net. Now, VDAs would need to be able to connect to this on TCP and UDP 443, obviously for TCP or UDP-based connections, respectively. So one of the gotchas that some people hit is that not all security appliances are going to be particularly great at handling wildcards. So there is actually a CTX article which specifies the gateway service POP addresses. Now, if you have issues in your environment using wildcard addresses to allow access, then you can use the explicit POP addresses that are listed in the CTX article. One thing to be considerate of is that obviously as a cloud service, there is a risk that the POP addresses may change. Therefore, it's going to be the customer's responsibility to make sure that they're maintaining an accurate list. So there is, if that list is not maintained, then there is a risk that you may experience some access issues. Now, if you're in a scenario where you can't allow network access via a security appliance and you need to have a proxy in place, a few important things to note. You can't do SSL interception. So for rendezvous connections, you can't get in line with the SSL connection. So it does some bidirectional validation, which means that if your proxy appliance is intercepting the SSL, decrypting and then re-encrypting, that will cause rendezvous connections to fail. So you'd need to disable SSL interception for those connections. Also, authentication at the proxy is not supported. So you'd need the ability to exclude authentication challenges for specific addresses. So depending on your proxy provider, if you have the ability to disable authentication for specific URLs, ideally wildcarded URLs, then you would need to implement that. So that's one to investigate with your proxy provider. Also, as mentioned before, in order to support EDT-based connections, you need the ability to support SOC 5 proxies. So if you've only got the ability to provide an HTTP proxy, then you'd need to be using TCP as your transport protocol. So another commonly missed requirement is in order for Rendezvous to work, the cloud connectors need to be able to resolve the FQDN for each VDA. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can implement this. You can, on the Citrix side, using the PowerShell SDK for Citrix Cloud, you have the ability to enable DNS resolution for the site. This would address that requirement. If you don't want to make that change or you're not comfortable making PowerShell-based changes to your environment, then you could also implement DNS reverse lookup zones. So for that, you'd need to ensure that you've got reverse lookup zones in place for the subnets that your VDAs reside in. And there's also some group policy configuration required to ensure that your VDAs will create pointer records in the correct reverse lookup zones to make sure that the cloud connectors are able to resolve the FQDN of the VDAs. So another one that's quite interesting that some people may have missed is MTU discovery. So MTU size matters. MTU size is basically the packet size that's going to be sent over the wire from one device to another. If an MTU size is too large to transit the path, then packets can be fragmented. So as we can see in the diagram on the right, if we're trying to send a 1500 byte packet over a network path that has a maximum MTU size of 1400 bytes, then the only way that packet can be sent over that path is if it's fragmented, so if it's split into multiple parts and then reassembled on the other end. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is that most VPNs and certainly any Citrix gateways in Azure, there will be a reduced MTU size on that path below the standard MTU size of 1500 bytes. So anything that's performing any kind of encapsulation of traffic, there is the likelihood that you would potentially need to reduce MTU size, otherwise you will be experiencing packet fragmentation. And this can have a noticeable impact on user experience if there is packet fragmentation going on for your Citrix connections. So there's a couple of ways that we can address this. So as of 1912 VDA, there is an option which is not enabled by default for using automatic MTU discovery. Now, this feature in combination with the Windows Workspace app allows the Citrix VDA to automatically discover the maximum MTU size that's going to be supported on the network path between the VDA and the client. So if you do have any network infrastructure in place which requires a smaller MTU size, the VDA would be able to adapt to that, and it will send smaller packet sizes to the maximum level that the path will support. Now, this can be implemented on the VDA side, so the setting needs to be in place on the VDA side to be able to support this. So on your VDA, you need to set the MTU discovery value to 1 in the registry key that you can see on the slides, and this will enable the automatic MTU discovery. So you'd need Workspace app to be 1912 or later, and you'd need the VDA to be 1912 or later to be able to support that. So you may have noticed that this is specific to Windows Workspace app. So if you're using Linux-based clients, Mac-based clients, or Android or iOS, then automatic MTU discovery isn't going to work for you. So this, in order to support smaller MTU sizes and deliver good performance for users, you'd need to modify the maximum MTU size in Storefront to be able to support that. Now, important to note there that I'm saying Storefront because it's not currently possible to modify that MTU size value in Citrix Workspace. So if you have a look at the CTX article on the slide, there are some steps in there which goes into the settings that need to be configured in the default ICA file, which would configure the maximum MTU size for those connections. So if you're using Windows Workspace app, it can be handled automatically. If you're using non-Windows based Workspace apps, then you'd need to investigate applying the maximum MTU size elsewhere, for example, in the default ICA. Now, Web Studio. Most of you may be aware that Web Studio was introduced to Citrix Cloud in Tech Preview last year. Personally, quite a big fan. It's been a long time coming. So Web Studio is now GA, so generally available in Citrix Cloud. So it's now become the default management console, which Citrix is steering people towards, and anyone who's used Citrix Cloud in the last week or so may have noticed that you now get a notice that the MMC-based Citrix Studio that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen is now deprecated and will be removed at some point in the future. Now, in terms of performance, I find Web Studio to be kind of a lot better. It's definitely a lot more lightweight, and I find it quite usable. And you may notice that there are actually some additional functionalities that are available through Web Studio, which are not currently available through MMC. So some of the new capabilities that are being introduced, which require UI components to configure, they will primarily be added to Web Studio. So it's pretty much the place to go now. One of the great things about Web Studio is that it's been part of a quite significant engineering effort from Citrix. So one of the challenges they've had in terms of being able to introduce a lightweight web-based management console for virtual apps and desktops is that rather than being kind of purely API driven, there was actually quite a lot of stuff going on inside of Citrix Studio, so inside of the MMC console in terms of validating inputs and a lot of business logic in terms of the processes that it's driving. Although it was largely backed by PowerShell, there was still a lot of heavy lifting that was being done in the MMC side. So in order to be able to support a lightweight web console, there's been a significant amount of engineering effort in terms of re-architecting the back-end APIs to be able to support that lightweight console. So most of the back-end that the Web Studio is talking to is all based off a new set of APIs that have been developed by Citrix, which are far more robust and introduce all the business logic that was previously implemented in the console. So there's a much more like-for-like capability in terms of what's available through the API and what's available through Web Studio. So for those of you that like automating things, the API is now available. So if any of you are interested in kind of orchestrating processes or kind of integrating Citrix virtual apps and desktops with other management systems or orchestration tools, I'd definitely recommend having a look at developer.cloud.com. As part of the API work, one of the main objectives was also to significantly improve the documentation in that space. So there is very detailed API documentation available. And also, if you're interested in getting started with using the REST APIs, then there's a very useful set of how-to articles in there, which give you some great use cases as to how you can start leveraging the APIs to perform specific functions. So moving on, is 2021 the year of Workspace? So most of you who are aware of Citrix Cloud will be aware that Citrix Workspace and Citrix Gateway Service are part of your virtual apps and desktop service entitlements. But a fair percentage of customers, I'd say probably the majority of customers, may not actually be using those services. So typical reasons why they may not be using them is kind of previous concerns around performance or lack of EDT support. Another major one would be high availability requirements. So there are some HA options that are available if you host your own access layer, so your Citrix Gateway and your storefront, that aren't available currently if you're using Citrix Workspace and Gateway Service. But with these in mind, some of the potential benefits of leveraging Citrix Workspace and Gateway Service is that you could potentially remove the need for hosting your own storefront and removing the need for hosting your own Citrix gateways. So especially if you're looking at kind of cloud-hosted infrastructure, then removing those can have a direct cost benefit. And also, I think we'd all be happier if there were less infrastructure to manage. So it's one of the things that we want to have a look at is kind of how we could potentially start utilizing some of those services more. So an important thing to consider with Workspace is that Workspace is more than just storefront in the cloud. Workspace is the access point for a lot of different capabilities. So rather than just apps and desktops, we've got things like secure workspace access, we've got micro apps, we've got content collaboration, share file, we've got endpoint management, all of these underpinned by analytics, and the entry point for all of these services, including apps and desktops, is Citrix Workspace. So through moving to Citrix Workspace, you potentially unlock a lot of additional capabilities as well as just being able to replace your storefront. So it's an important thing to bear in mind. So one of the things I wanted to cover off is a recent addition. So high availability for Citrix Cloud. So a common customer concern is that when you're using an access layer that's hosted in the cloud, so Workspace and Gateway Service, what happens if there's a service outage? So what happens if the virtual apps and desktop service goes down, isn't contactable for any reason, or there's an internet issue that prevents your cloud connectors from being able to access it? So what happens then? So This is where Citrix have introduced a new feature called service continuity. So what service continuity does is when users connect to Citrix Workspace using Workspace app for Windows, if service continuity is enabled, then for each of the resources that a user is entitled to access, Workspace app will download a connection lease for that particular resource. Now, these are stored in the user profile. The connection leases are signed to prevent tampering, and they've got a validity period configured by administrators. So you can set it between 1 and 30 days, so you can define how long that particular lease is going to be valid for. So those connection leases, because they're quite important, they're AES-256 encrypted, and those connection leases are bound to that particular device. So there's public-private key pair, which is uniquely associated with that device, which means that you can't take those connection leases and put them on another device and use that to authorize access. The connection leases, they control entitlement for access, and they can be used to authorize access through Citrix Gateway Service or through the cloud connectors in the event that Citrix cloud services are unavailable. So if you're connecting externally from the environment, then the connection lease can be presented to Citrix Gateway Service, and that would authorize Citrix Gateway Service to allow the user to connect to the resource. If they're internal, then as long as they have a line of sight to the resources, so to the cloud connectors and the VDAs, then users can establish direct connection internally. So both of these can work in the event that there's a virtual apps and desktop service outage for any reason. So as I say, that could be a legitimate service outage, or that could be if users are connected internally and there's a local internet access issue. As long as they have line of sight, then they're still able to access resources. So when Workspace app goes into this outage mode, there is a notification to users to let them know that something's going on. So we can see in the image here, the user is in outage mode. So Workspace app is telling them that it's unable to connect to some of their resources. So we can see there's a couple of SaaS applications that may not be available because they're not delivered through apps and desktops. But the user does still have 2 published applications which there are connection leases available for, which would be available to launch. So this helps give some decent resiliency in the event of a cloud outage without having to have Citrix gateways and storefront hosted in your environment. So just to highlight a few current limitations with this solution. So it's currently in public tech preview. So there is a sign up link in the slide, which allows you to request service continuity to be enabled in your cloud tenant. It's expected to be GA soon though, so if you don't want to be an early adopter, then it should be available. I believe the target is around Q2. It will be becoming available as standard to all tenants in the near future. So currently it's limited to Windows Workspace app only. Browser access isn't going to give you the service continuity features. Obviously, there's some functionality which is built into the Workspace app in terms of being able to request and securely store those connection leases that isn't possible to support through a browser interface. Also important to note that this does not work with hosted or on-premises Citrix gateways. It's only the Citrix Gateway service because it's using a different authorization mechanism for the connections in the event that the apps and desktop service is not available. So in order for it to work, you need to be on VDA version 2012 or newer, and you need to have Workspace app 2012 or newer. So obviously we'd recommend that you stay current with those to make sure that you're getting the latest and greatest features. In an outage mode, there's no single sign-on. So important to note that the connection leases that are stored do not store credentials. So even though it will authorize the connection, the user would be prompted to authenticate to the resource. So they'll just get a standard Windows credentials prompt when they connect to the VDA. The cloud connectors, which is a change from the default configuration. So for internal access, they must allow connections on 1494 and 2598. Now, this is because in outage mode, the initial connection from Workspace app is going to be established to the cloud connectors before it goes to the VDAs. So it's important that if you do have firewall products in place on your cloud connectors, then you must enable access on 1494 and 2598 to be able to support connections. And also, FAS authenticated connections are not currently supported. So this is a space that's being actively developed. I think high availability has been identified as an area of concern for some customers, where they do want to be able to offer similar levels of availability that they can when they host their own solutions. So this is the first iteration that Citrix are introducing to help bridge that gap. So looking back at some of the challenges or concerns that we went through earlier in terms of why people may not be adopting Citrix Workspace. If we look at performance, so in the last 6 months, EDT support's been introduced to the Citrix Gateway service. So in combination with Rendezvous, we have the ability to deliver high performance user connections. So that's one less concern in respect to performance. So for high availability, service continuity is going to be GA soon. So for Windows Workspace app, there's fewer concerns in terms of solution high availability. And in terms of missing features, it's something that's being aggressively developed by Citrix to make sure that in terms of any feature gaps between Storefront and Workspace, they are aggressively trying to reduce any blocking issues. So if there are any particular features which may be blocking your adoption, I'd certainly be interested in your feedback as to kind of what they may be. So we can feed that into Citrix's priority list. And keep your eyes out soon. So if you keep your eye on Ultima's blogs, then there will be a blog post going out hopefully in the next couple of weeks, which will have a more detailed breakdown on some of the workspace capabilities and kind of around service continuity and kind of how that adds value for customers. So on to networking. So the main thing I want to talk about is the big update that's due later this year. So Citrix is going to be releasing Citrix ADC 13.1, and why this is quite an important one to consider. So 13, typically we've kind of steered away from it. It's been a little bit of a handful. I think our safe harbor for most customers has been on the 12.1 release branch. 13's been a bit of a handful at times, shall we say. It's got much better in recent releases, but I think some of the earlier versions were challenging. What tends to happen with Citrix is that .0 releases of ADC firmware tends to be very feature rich. They're very aggressive in terms of introducing new capabilities and new features and functionalities to the software. Obviously, with big changes can come big defects, and it can be a bit of a journey to get to a point where you have the features and stability that you need to be able to deliver a reliable platform. So we're now getting to that space with version 13. A lot of customers are starting to move in that direction, so it's certainly the direction of travel. So in terms of life cycle of firmware versions, since version 13, Citrix have changed their life cycle slightly. So the previous lifecycle approach for Citrix ADC firmware used to be that for .0 releases, there'd be a 3-year support lifecycle, and for .1 releases, there'd be a 5-year support lifecycle, which steered people more towards .1 releases, hence why we see a large percentage of the customer base being on 12.1 currently. Now, since version 13, Citrix have decided that all Citrix ADC releases are going to receive a 5-year support lifecycle. And any subsequent ADC firmware releases will receive that same support lifecycle. So just to give you an idea as to what that support lifecycle looks like. So years 1 and 2, there are new feature releases every quarter. So this will be new functionality being added to the firmware. Years 3 and 4 will be based on maintenance releases, so kind of primarily bug fixes and security fixes. So they will be on a faster cadence initially, and then the release cadence will slow down towards the end of that period. And then year 5 will be tech support only until the end of life date. So if we look at 12.1, we've got an end of maintenance date, which is next May. We've got an end of life date in 2023, and for 13 currently we have an end of maintenance period in May 2023. So those are some dates to bear in mind. So one thing that actually wasn't kind of immediately apparent until we were looking at some customers a little while ago is that you may need to update depending on where you're running your Citrix ADC. So if you're running virtual appliances, you may not know, but if you're running on VMware 6.5 or higher, then technically the only supported ADC version is actually version 13. Now, obviously, there's a distinction between does it work and is it supported, but in terms of supported platforms, if you're running on VMware 6.5 or up, then you should be on version 13. Now, obviously, if you're running 12.1, that's working fine, then that's okay, but it's something to bear in mind just to kind of avoid any awkward conversations with support if they were to reference this. So that's something that may inspire some movement to move towards later versions. So looking at 13.1, my main message would be start upgrade planning early. So main reason being is that 13.1 removes the support for classic expressions, and it's only going to support advanced expressions with a exclusion for Citrix gateway policies and AAA pre-authentication policies. So if you're using traffic management virtual servers, if you're using kind of any functionality on the appliances other than gateway or AAA pre-auth, then if you are using classic expressions, those will not be supported on 13.1. So there's a few ways that you could approach this. You've got the options of either upgrade, convert, or redeploy. So for upgrade, if you're already on advanced policies, or if you've already implemented advanced policies across all the functionalities that you're using, well done. You can just do an upgrade as standard. If you're not in that position, you do have classic policies in place, then Citrix do provide a tool called NSPEPI. Now you can find some more information on that on the CTX article in the slide. And that tool can be used to either convert individual expressions, or you can even feed it your entire configuration file. And that will do the heavy lifting to basically convert from classic policies to advanced policies. Now, it's going to do a lot of the heavy lifting. It's not necessarily going to be 100% success rate, depending on what policy expressions you're using will impact on the success rate. But it can do a lot, like I say, it can do a lot of the heavy lifting, but there's likely to be some kind of manual intervention required to make sure that all of your configuration converts okay. Alternatively, you've got the option of redeploying. So this could be the preferred route. So if you look at a scenario where you're going to have to rework a lot of your policy configuration, then it may be a preferred route to look to redeploy that configuration. So a consideration is that NSPEPI is going to do a conversion, so it's going to do a like-for-like replication of classic to advanced policies. Now, conversion doesn't equal optimization. So there's a lot of additional capabilities that advanced policies may give you. So if you're just converting, then you're not going to be able to make use of any of the new capabilities. So it's worthwhile considering redeploying so you can evaluate what the options are with the new advanced policies and whether or not it introduces any different approaches that you may be able to make use of. So again, important to note, because we do tend to see a lot of classic policies around gateway and AAA, especially around security policies. So those are going to be supported in 13.1, as they will be potentially removed after Q2 2023. So that's another date to bear in mind. So security. Some of you may or may not have heard of SASE. So in 2019, Gartner published a paper. For those of you who like reading Gartner papers, it's certainly a good read. So it's on the future of network security is in the cloud. Now, the main purpose of this paper is to define a new delivery model for network security, which is called SASE, or Secure Access Service Edge. So what this is effectively doing is it's effectively expanding on a concept which Citrix has been extolling for several years now, which is security perimeters have now moved beyond the data center. So if you're maintaining security architecture which assumes that everything inside the data center is trusted and everything outside the data center is untrusted, then that's kind of a legacy approach. And the new security perimeter needs to be dynamic, it needs to be policy-based, it needs to encompass a lot of other devices, use cases to adapt to how people work today. So broadly speaking, SASE is a convergence of two different things. It's convergence of network as a service and network security as a service delivered from the cloud. So SASE capabilities are based upon the identity of the entity in a real-time context, enterprise security compliance policies with continuous assessment of risk and trust throughout sessions. So it could encompass people, devices, application services, IoT systems, so anywhere that applications and data are consumed. So how does Citrix align with this today? So in terms of network as a service, we have Citrix SD-WAN and our SD-WAN orchestrator providing network as a service capabilities to provide that high performance continuous access. We've got continual risk assessment underpinned by Citrix Security for Analytics. In terms of securely delivering applications, we're all familiar with virtual apps and desktops. We've also got Citrix Secure Workspace access, which adds another layer of capabilities in that space. And we have network security as a service, so through a new capability which Citrix announced earlier this year with Citrix Secure Internet Access. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about the Secure Workspace access and the Secure Internet Access, just so you're familiar with what those offer and how they can be used. So for Secure Workspace access, this is about how we provide zero trust network access, single sign-on to multiple applications. We can provide contextual workspace security controls, remote browser capabilities, and application protection. So Secure Workspace Access provides unified access to all applications. So any managed application, be it a classic Win32 app delivered through apps and desktops, if it's a SaaS application, so cloud-hosted SaaS, or an internal web app, these can all be delivered using Secure Workspace Access. To deliver those, we can apply granular security controls, so a level above CASB protection, so we don't require API level integration with the SaaS providers. We can wrap these applications in security controls provided by Workspace app to secure your data, to prevent data egress, to watermark content. So there's a lot of security controls which you can apply to these applications, to all managed applications, to add additional layers of security to provide that level of zero trust access. You can provide endpoint checks using kind of integration with ADC to provide contextual access and MFA of your choosing. We've got the ability to provide browser isolation. So for risky or secure applications, you can run those in a secure browser which lives and dies with that session. So if a user's accessing potentially risky content that you don't want to expose to your network, that can run in an environment separate from their device. If you want to provide access to secure applications, but you don't want to expose that data to an untrusted endpoint, again, you can deliver that from a cloud-hosted browser. So being able to tactically control how you're exposing your data to endpoints. And all of this underpinned by analytics for security, so providing that continuous monitoring process, understanding how users are working with the applications to gauge what is their risk level at any given time, and the ability to introduce some kind of closed loop remediation actions, so being able to trigger additional layers of monitoring, or potentially revoke access if you see something that you're just not happy with in that environment. And being able to apply that uniformly across all applications, all managed applications. Now, we then have secure internet access. So secure internet access is something that Citrix have introduced as of January, February time this year. So secure internet access provides some key security capabilities. So this is where we're looking at the network security as a service. So it can provide secure web gateway, firewall, CASB, malware, DLP, malware protection, DLP, sandboxing. And we can provide this across all users. So the secure internet access service has over 100 POPs globally. So regardless of where your users are, there are points of presence local to them to provide that high performance aspect. High performance for the users. We've got the ability to protect users against the latest threats. So rather than kind of aligning with one security provider, secure internet access integrates with over 10 threat engines to make sure that you've got a very broad detection of any zero-day or new threats to your environment. Now, there's a lot of capabilities. I'm not going to dwell on these too long. So interesting things. So DLP, again, important thing to understand with secure internet access, this applies across all devices. So this applies across Windows, this can apply at the branch office level, this can apply across mobile devices. So there's integration for Android, iOS, Windows, Mac OS. Any device a user's working from, secure internet access can protect. And we can provide that CASB protection, making sure that data is not going to places that it shouldn't do, being able to enforce data storage policies across supported SaaS providers, providing secure web gateway capabilities, so your standard URL filtering, being able to detect malicious code, filtering different web categories. We've got the malware protection, so that unified approach to making sure that all access for the user is protected, regardless of whether it's to a managed application or just a user browsing the internet. And equally, universal data loss protection prevention, being able to understand based on the user's entire internet activity whether or not data that they're sending to different services or files that they're sending to different services, do they contain data that is sensitive, and does that need to be blocked? And sandboxing capabilities, again, kind of aligned with the malware protection, being able to safely execute suspicious code in an isolated environment. So blowing up in a sandbox rather than on the endpoint device gives you great protection against zero-day attacks. So with secure workspace access and secure internet access combined, secure workspace access protects your managed applications. That gives you a secure mechanism to access your apps and desktop service, your SaaS applications, your internal web apps. You can deliver those securely to any device. You can wrap them with the security controls that you need and deliver them from the location that you need to deliver them from, whether that be to the user's device or to a remote browser instance. Secure internet access covers everything else. So obviously users work on devices, they're going to access different services, be they sanctioned or unsanctioned. Secure internet access gives you protection against common risks across all of those other services. So from a malware perspective, DLP, firewalling, sandboxing, all those capabilities are laid across every other application, giving you universal protection against threats which may affect users' ability to operate. So if we look at the Citrix stack as a whole, with secure internet access, secure workspace access underpinned by analytics, and with our network as a service provided by Citrix SD-WAN, there's a pretty comprehensive security stack there to be able to protect all users on all devices in all locations when accessing any application, be they managed, unmanaged, or internet-based. And some of the key capabilities, the unified management, and again, this is one of the key objectives of SASE is to be able to provide a single vendor approach. So rather than having 15 problems and then finding 15 products to try and solve those problems, having a unified approach as to how you deliver those. So unified management helps simplify operations. It makes it easier to run. It makes it easier for administrators to be able to have a single approach to fairly broad problem sets. With secure internet access, we can see and block all threats. So with all user traffic transiting secure internet access services, we can provide unified protection to all access, regardless of whether it's to managed applications or unmanaged. With secure workspace access, you can provide the right access to the right apps. And again, this is kind of one of the fundamentals that Citrix offers, is being able to provide any application to any device at any time. And the key message there is to be able to do all that securely. Now, with analytics, we've got the ability to provide actionable insights, and that's kind of the really important thing. It's not necessarily just another data feed. It can indicate when something's wrong and give you actions that you can perform based on that. So being able to provide the actionable insights based on what we see from user behavior within the environment across all these services. And with Citrix SD-WAN, we've got the ability to provide best app performance with reliability. So being able to perform application-specific network optimization and routing to be able to support the best user experience and make sure that traffic takes the right path, be that to data centers, be that to the internet via the secure internet access service. Citrix SD-WAN can underpin the fundamentals of being able to provide connectivity to users. So how can we help? Now, I appreciate we've talked about a lot of different products and features, and that can be one of the challenges with these, is that there's so many capabilities, there's so many options. Where do you get started? So this is where we can help. So Ultima are one of a few partners that Citrix work with to deliver their customer success program. So this is all about how we can help you get more out of Citrix. So working with Citrix, we can help you get the most out of your Citrix investment. So make sure that you're using what you've paid for. So a lot, like we say with Workspace and Gateway Service, there's a lot of customers that aren't necessarily leveraging those. And there may be costs associated with that we can help alleviate. So we can help guide you on that path. So we can ensure that you're aware and able to adopt and deploy new capabilities. So like we say, we've talked about a few new capabilities. Those are but a few of many. I could talk for hours about all the new things that Citrix have introduced. So we've just gone through a few highlights today. But obviously we can engage with you and understand how some of those new capabilities can fit with different use cases in your environment. So where you do have new requirements, new challenges, we can work with you to help understand how you can use the tools that you have available to be able to deliver on those. So we can work with you to create a success plan. So a success plan is quite an interesting thing. It's effectively an approach to make sure that where you define what it is that you want to get out of a particular solution, we can help map that out, understand how you get to the value that you're expecting, and then reassess where we are versus the goals. So rather than just deploying technology for the sake of deploying technology, it's really about aligning that with what are the benefits that you're expecting from that, and how do we make sure that we're actually delivering on those. And we can also help reduce time to value. So again, there's a lot of capabilities available. There are a lot of services available. Now, when you adopt these, really you want to start being able to gain benefits from those as soon as possible. So this is where, with our experience and our knowledge, we can help guide you through adopting those services to make sure that you are getting what you expect out of them as quickly as possible, so you can start delivering the business benefits much faster. So how can we do this? So if you've got more than 100 users, then contact your account manager. So then we can have a conversation about how we can work with the customer success program. Or if you want to just investigate some of the options yourself, then you can go to success.citrix.com. There's some brilliant resources there around how you can develop your own success plan. Obviously, we'd love to go on this journey with you, so we're always available to help. But if you want to find some resources just to see what's available, then you can visit success.citrix.com, where you have resources where you can start developing your own success plans. So, just to recap, a few key takeaways. So this year, consider if Workspace is going to be suitable for you. There's a lot of enhancements that have been introduced. If you've looked at it a couple of years ago or a year ago and thought it's not quite there yet, it's definitely worthwhile reevaluating. As I say, keep a lookout on our blogs. There'll be a kind of much more deep dive blog post in terms of what the current capabilities are and kind of where maybe some of the challenges are. So that could be a useful reference if you're considering whether it's going to be an option for you. And also consider what it may unlock. So a lot of, as we say, it's more than just storefront. There's a lot of other capabilities behind Workspace, a lot of really interesting ones. So you may find that moving to Workspace is about more than just replacing or removing storefront, the environment. It may be about introducing some new capabilities that could add value to users. So a more general one, so 2020 was a year of big and fast changes. Everyone got a lot done really quickly. So this year, we're encouraging people. It's a good opportunity to reassess, make sure that if you've introduced new things, that you're making best use of the tools and capabilities that you've got available. So whereas last year was more about tactical changes and adapting and responding to the current scenario, make 2021 about making more strategic decisions about kind of where you want to take things. If you've got Citrix ADCs, think about how you're going to move to 13 or 13.1. Are you going to update, convert, or redeploy? Again, if you've got challenges around that, do let us know. Obviously, we've got the ability to help you with that process. And think about how Citrix does more than just apps and desktops. So we've talked a bit about some of the security capabilities. And if you look at the whole Citrix stack, there's quite a compelling offering there. So if you're looking to kind of standardize how you're delivering your security model, there are a lot of capabilities that Citrix can provide. So again, important to remember, Citrix does way more than just apps and desktops now. And finally, work with Ultima and Citrix through the Success Program, and together we can help you get the most out of your investment and make sure that you're getting the value that you can gain from Citrix solutions. So with that, I think we're pretty much bang on time. So I'd just like to thank everyone for joining. Hopefully that's been useful. Yeah, I hope you all have a fantastic weekend, and do get in touch if anyone submitted any questions in the panel. We'll reach out to you offline and get those answered. If anyone wants to talk more about any of the things we've covered on this webinar, reach out to your account manager. Happy to have kind of further, more specific conversations around any particular requirements that you've got. So with that, thank you very much and have a great weekend.